Hey, in this video we'll discuss variables and the print and print line function. To start off with, we'll type void setup and void draw. Okay, so variables are names that hold values. The values can be either a whole number, a decimal point number, characters, or sentences. In computer science, sentences are referred to as strings. You'll see examples of strings later on when we discuss characters. So to create variables, there are two ways to do that. One is called declaration, and the other is called initialization. They're very similar, but they have different forms. So let's first talk about variable declaration. It has this form where you have type, the name, and a semicolon. So what I've written up here is basically a template for what you'll be substituting in between the angle brackets. For type, you need to specify a type for the variable, and for name, you need to specify a name for the variable, and then a semicolon. Let's first discuss what an integer is. So an integer in mathematics is a whole number that is either negative, 0, or positive. To create a variable that is an integer, we first have to type in the type, which is int. Int is short for integer, and then we have to give the variable a name. Now you can call it x, you can call it y, or you can give it any other name. And you can call it Nancy for all the computer cares. But for our purpose, let's call it x. So x is the variable name, int is the type, and notice that it has this form where the first word is the type. You have int there, and for name, you have the variable name x. So this is an example of a declaration. This instruction on line 4 tells the computer that there is a variable that the programmer, has created a variable x of type int. The second way to indicate to the computer that a variable exists is by variable initialization. And it is very similar to variable declaration in that the form is almost the same. So you have a type, the name, the equal sign, and then an initial value, and then a semicolon. So to initialize another variable of type integer, we can first indicate a type. We use the int for now. We give it a name. I'm going to call it y, the equal sign, and we need to give it an initial value. Now, because an integer is a number that is either negative, 0, or positive, we can give it an initial value of, say, 67. So here, the computer creates a variable called y, and it has the type integer, so the computer knows that it's an integer, and it assigns the value negative 67 to that variable y. Now you can create as many variables as you want, but the thing is, after you can only create a variable once. So once you declare or initialize a variable, you can't reinitialize or redeclare a variable. So writing the statement here will cause an error. As you can see down here, duplicate field sketch. The computer is saying that you already have a variable called x that exists in computer memory, and so to issue the same statement is illegal. Similarly, you can't reinitialize y. like that. But what you can do is reassign the variable y with a different negative number, or assign the value x with some number. And you can only do that inside a function. Void setup is a function. Void draw is also a function. So inside void setup, for instance, we can assign x with a new value, a new integer value. We can, for instance, give it the number 10. And we can give y the number 100 here. But if I do it outside of these brackets, the braces, the computer will complain. Here, expecting EOF found X. So this is an illegal assignment statement because it's outside of a function here. These are okay. The computer is programmed to accept, to read initialization and declaration statements outside of these braces. But assignments, which are these two statements, must be inside the braces in a function. And we'll talk about functions more in a couple videos. And the last thing I want to discuss is the different types of variables that you can have. So above we've discussed the integer. There are several other types that you need to familiarize yourself with because they're very handy to know. One is called the double, and this holds any decimal value. Now the decimal value may be negative or positive. There's the character, holds any single character. We'll discuss in a moment what qualifies as a character. Then you have the string, holds any multiple characters. And then you have boolean, holds either true or false. First, let's talk about a double. So, like the integer, you can either choose to declare it or initialize it. We'll make a couple of declarations. Actually, we'll initialize a variable for each one of these types here, just as an example. So let's initialize the variable double, and let's give it a name. My first double. Now, generally, when you give names to variables, whenever you write a name, it's helpful to capitalize the first letter of a new word when you're putting one word after another word. It's easier to read. That's one convention. Another convention that people like to follow is to put an underscore in in a variable name and not have to capitalize the first word. And that's what I like to do personally. So here we've declared a variable of type double called my first double. Now I wanted it to be an initialization, so I'm just gonna give an initial value here, and you can see that if I run the program, I will not generate an error. Alright, let's move on. Character, my first character. So a character in processing can be any alphabetic character. So characters A through Z. A through Z. So this is a valid initialization here. So if you were to run this, the program would not cause an error here. What you may not know is that characters in programming also includes these special characters, like the exclamation point, the at symbol, the pound symbol, the dollar sign, the percent sign, the star sign. also the apostrophe or the what have you, the slash or the angle brackets. They're all considered characters. That's because characters in programming are a subset of the ASCII characters, not the English alphabet characters. They're from the ASCII character set. The space is also considered a character. What's special about a character is that it must be, when you give it a value, you must include the single quotation marks around that single character. And what's special about a character is that a character variable can only hold one character. It can't hold multiple characters. So something like this would be invalid because there are two characters that's being assigned to a single character variable. You can see here that the computer complains about it. Invalid character constant. This value is invalid because there are two characters. Let's move on to the string. So the string character, or the string variable, solves the problem that the character variable has, which is not being able to store multiple ASCII characters. To create or to give a value to a variable type string, you need to encase the value in double quotation marks. So here I have the string hello world inside, or in between two double quotation marks. Now you can see here that each one of these, the reason why it's called a string is because you're stringing together characters. I believe that's the reason why the type is called a string. You can consider them sentences, but if you were to talk to a programmer, you would have to refer to things that are encased in quotes as strings. A string is pretty standard. A sentence is not. If you were to tell a programmer, assign this value to this, assign this sentence to a string variable, they wouldn't know what you were talking about. You need to refer to this as a string. In particular, the string value is hello world with an exclamation point at the end. And let's discuss one more type called boolean. So a boolean is a variable that holds either the keyword true or the keyword false. Alternatively, you can use the number 0 or the number 1. Or actually, I'm sorry, you can't use the number 0 here. In other languages, you can substitute true for 1 and false for 0, but in this language, you cannot. You must use the keyword true if you want the Boolean variable, myBool, to store the value true, and you must use the keyword false to assign the value false to the Boolean variable, myBool. Anything else will generate an error. For instance, if you assign it 3.14, which is something you should be assigning to a double, you can see that here that generates an error when you run. Type mismatch. Float does not match with the Boolean. Yeah, float is similar to a double in that a float also stores a decimal point. We use double because it's more precise. But to prove my point, my second decimal, and we'll call that 6.28. Okay. Now this is to show that the float type takes in decimal point numbers. Here I'm going to substitute that for negative numbers. Oh, I need to change this back. I run it, and it runs fine. Okay. So float is another type that stores decimal point numbers. So to recap, there are two ways to create variables. When you create a variable, you're letting the computer know of the variables that you're creating. One way is by declaration. and the other way is by initialization. The declaration has this form, and the initialization has this form. You can't redeclare or reinitialize a variable. You can't tell the computer that a variable exists twice. And there are many different types of variables. You have the double, the character, the string, and the boolean, each holding different types of values. And in the next couple of videos, we'll discuss how some of these types may be used. That's it for now. I'll see you soon.